Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Pitts. I'm the Interim Associate Vice President for Justice Policy here at the Urban Institute. And we're very happy to have you all with us today for a conversation about post-secondary education in prison as part of our Prison Research Meets Practice series that we are hosting as part of our Prison Research and Innovation Initiative. Before we get started with our conversation, though, I want to handle a few housekeeping items with you. The first of these is that the event is being recorded today, and that recording is going to be posted online afterward. The speaker biographies are available for you to access online on the event webpage at urban.org. For accessibility, we are providing ASL translation and have closed captioning enabled as well. You can adjust your caption settings with the Show Hide Captions button. All of the participants are muted, but you can type your questions or comments into the Q&A box at any time, and we will get to them at the end. We ask that you please take 1 to 2 minutes to complete the survey at the end of the event. And lastly, we ask that you engage with us on social media using #LiveAtUrban. So now I will invite our two panelists to join me on camera, and I will introduce them briefly. We have with us today Terrell Blount, who is the Executive Director of the formerly incarcerated College Graduates Network. And we also have, if she can join us, Professor Erin Castro, who's Associate Dean and Executive Director of the Research Collaborative on Higher Education in Prison at the University of Utah. And so I'm going to be asking Terrell and Erin some questions for the next 45 or so minutes, and then we will save time at the end for question and answer from you. And so we ask that you please submit questions using the box on the screen, and we'll get to those at the end of the session today. All right. So I'd like to start with Erin, and just to ground us in some basics, what does the research say about the benefits of post-secondary education for those who are incarcerated?
I wish my answer was more optimistic. It doesn't say a ton. Well, we have lots. First of all, let me just preface this by saying we have lots of rigorous, high quality evidence to support the impact and the effectiveness of post-secondary education writ large. Unfortunately, much of what we know about kind of post-participation, post-completion outcomes for folks who have experienced incarceration or are currently incarcerated comes from the fields of criminology mostly. And so what we tend to see are criminological outcomes, things like reduced recidivism, decreased risk, increased protective factors. And so, in that world, what we know is that the more education someone has access to, the less likely they are to be sent back to prison. However, as an educational researcher, it irks me to say that because there are so many more educationally derived questions that we need to be asking, particularly as it relates to students who maybe participate in some post-secondary education during incarceration, but don't complete, or are released before they complete, or complete a credential inside. We don't know a lot at this point in time in terms of what the specific impacts of higher education are for currently incarcerated people.
Great. Thank you. So I guess moving to Terrell, Terrell, you lead an organization that focuses on promoting post-secondary education for people who are or have been incarcerated, a growing organization thanks to your leadership. So thank you for that. Can you talk a bit about what FICGN does and whether some of the things Erin talked about, if those things match your work with that community of people?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I first want to say thank you, David, for inviting me for this conversation, as well as the Urban Institute and my longtime colleague and friend, Erin Castro. So definitely appreciate, being invited to this conversation. I think building off of, what Erin said, I think what I really appreciate is her using the term like impact, right? I think very often different groups of folks tend to look at education in prison as a solution to something, right? The solution to people no longer recidivating, a solution to the prisons being much more calmer and safer for incarcerated people and correction staff. Those are things that I really see as benefits, right? Not necessarily the reasons why we should be doing it. And my stance, and I think a lot of people's in FICGN stance, is that education is something that should simply be provided to folks without, looking at whether or not this program is actually going to stop people from returning to prison. It's something that should just be, especially if you have colleges that are, willing to come inside and offer programming. So that's something that I think I would like for folks to just think about when we talk about this work, because, we think about colleges on the outside. How much are we scrutinizing how many people are getting jobs after they graduate from the university? We're not shutting down any, major universities because 40% of the students or graduates actually, wound up getting jobs while the 60% are not. So we shouldn't be so quick to, measure the program's validity based on reentry outcomes, which, as Erin pointed out, though it's more based on criminology and other schools of thought, as opposed to if you are looking at a program and simply looking at the education outcomes that, are normally measured in other cases. But as far as FICGN, the formerly incarcerated college graduates network, we really started out and still remain to this day an inclusive community of people with prior incarceration experience and also post-secondary education attainment or aspirations. It really started from people across the country that had those two identities of having participated in college, whether pre-prison, during prison, or after prison. And people just feeling, isolated post-incarceration. For a lot of folks that, use college or have, not even use college, but haven't participated in college, and that being something that has turned their life around. When you go back to those same communities that you once were in, those social circles aren't always either accepting of you or, you may just choose to go in a different direction. So with so many people experiencing that post-prison, we got together online and it was just a space for people to connect. But since me being in leadership, we've also begun to, branch out and start doing work inside prisons with incarcerated students, helping them towards degree attainment, and then also removing policy barriers that burden the student experience.
Great. Thank you, Terrell. Thank you. Yeah, so it seems like this is an issue that people on both sides of the aisle politically can get behind. And I'm thinking specifically of this summer's reinstatement of federal Pell Grants for those who are incarcerated. And so, Erin, I'm wondering if you might be able to walk us through why Pell Grants are such an important piece to prison-based education.
Sure. I think if we look historically, the Pell Grant was never, I think, designed to serve incarcerated students. But what we quickly found out is that when you're incarcerated, you are most likely eligible because you meet the income requirements. Because if we could, there's this narrative that we had Pell in prison, and in 1994 it was removed, and we had all these programs, and then after Pell was removed, all those programs shrunk, and it's this kind of tale of devastation, and that is true. But I think what is also true about that is that those programs disappeared because Pell was their only funding stream. And what we're finding in the research is that while Pell is critical, particularly for two-year schools to do this work, and we know that over 55% of the colleges and universities providing in-prison higher education right now are two-year schools, it's a critical funding mechanism. That being said, I always just have to say that we don't have a lot of evidence at this point that there's a lot of other financial and material supports in addition to Pell funding that we would like to see. And so, if I'm thinking 20 years from now, let's hope that Pell doesn't get taken and removed again. But what are we doing right now to ensure that we don't have another 95, 96, 97, 98 happen? And I think, so on one hand, it's critical, but in part it's critical because we haven't bolstered the resources necessary to serve this population of students outside of Pell. And that's telling, unfortunately.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, so thinking about, I guess, the political process that Pell reinstatement required, I want to move to Terrell. And Terrell, I know you played a part in that movement along with a number of others, and it's impossible, of course, to identify every single person in an entity that played a role. But I'm wondering if you might give us a sense of what it took to get that passed and what it took for that to be successful, maybe the diversity of folks that were involved in that lobbying effort.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you named, so many people across the country, some who I'm, very familiar with, others I may not have ever crossed paths with at all, but so many different stakeholder groups participated in the push for Pell Grant reinstatement. And, I think when you think about social justice organizations, policy organizations, and the pieces that they bring to the work. When you think about correctional leadership, I saw, a dozen or so correctional leaders come, to Washington, D.C. Before, the pandemic hit. And, they sitting in rooms with legislators and other folks in office and being there. And as I look around the room, there's, a formerly incarcerated student from that particular state. There's the correctional leader, there's the director of education for the prison system. To see, those people from different facets of this work, coming together on one common issue, which is, the importance of post-secondary education in prison. I know, with my own eyes, the work that it took to get people, in those spaces and for the field to get to that point. And I think system impacted individuals, those who are currently and also formerly incarcerated, their voices during the pandemic lent a huge voice, again, if you will, to this work. So when those visits to the Capitol stopped, FICGN worked with College and Community Fellowship as well as the Drug Policy Alliance. And they, us together held different calls, Zoom calls and phone calls. We organized and, tapped into our network from different states and asked them to participate and share their stories. And this was at a time when, literally the world like basically stopped and, so many things was put on hold. But, if I really had to just zero out, it really was an effort that took people from all different sides of this table, where on day-to-day things, we might be concerned with other things, like people from the colleges being focused on education and, things of that nature, corrections being focused on safety and security, incarcerated people focused on what, they see as like basic rights. But we were all able to come together and make this happen. And I think that's just a glaring example of what can happen when allies and advocates, all come together on one common ground.
Thanks, Terrell. That's great. I want to stick with you for a second, though, and talk a little bit about implementation. So obviously, there's a lot of excitement about Pell reinstatement. We're thinking about this as an opportunity to expand the educational opportunities that are available for people who are incarcerated. But we probably also need to be realistic, right, about the implementation side, because we all know that when we implement new policies and programs in a correctional environment, that can be really tough. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what we need to be watching out for as we navigate Pell changes. And I'm wondering if there's anything that worries you as we think about implementation.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say worry. I think there may be some, observations, things I'll be observing is what I'll say. And first, I want to say that, I really feel like if groundbreaking is the term, to my knowledge, there hasn't been a situation where state correction departments are essentially being told that they have to, consult with outside entities in order to, agree on or pass on a program. And I think that's somewhat of a win, maybe not a full victory, but I think in this space, for the U.S. Department of Education to, when figuring out what the prison education program process will look like, for them to say that the corrections departments who eventually will be making the final decision on whether or not a prison educate or a college is going to be called a prison education program and draw down on Pell grants, while they're still like the lone decision maker, the fact that they have to reach out to what they're calling relevant stakeholders, I think is a pretty big thing. Now, whether or not they take all of our, recommendations and votes and however that process looks like in that particular state, whether they take that with a grain of salt or, really like lean into it. And my hope is that in some of these states, there's real, thought partnership and collaboration. And I think in some states, some colleges are probably having their fingers crossed that the DOC just says, hey, consortium, you take all of this. And hopefully that's something that works for them. But I think just even having that as a thing is something we shouldn't really downplay, because, out of all of the programs that they have in corrections departments, tell me which other ones are, reliant on a consortium or a group of people, formerly incarcerated people, to approve this program, this father's program or this NA program. It doesn't happen. So I just want to name that. I don't think, that's spoken about often. We tend to poke holes in the outcome, which is that correction still has the final say so, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. And to, just speak a little bit more to your question, I think the one thing I would just kind of like, be on the lookout for is just how much formerly incarcerated and possibly even currently incarcerated learners are offering their voices to this process. So one of the things for FICGN, I want to make sure that in each state where there are system impacted or specifically formerly incarcerated people being engaged in these consortia, that those people are equipped to, really know what to look out for, what to spot, how to lend their voice. So we're working on, things that can prepare people from our network or outside of our network to, fully engage in these conversations.
Thanks, Terrell. Thank you. Yeah, and I want to turn to Erin next. And I guess thinking about how how post-secondary education programs have developed over time in prison. So many of the longest operating programs are offered by private institutions or nonprofit private institutions that heavily subsidize what would otherwise be pretty unaffordable tuition for people in prison. And so now that Pell Grants are back in play, it seems like these prison-based post-secondary education programs will become more appealing to colleges maybe that were previously unable to make them work financially. And so as we think about in the higher ed space, where we have a decreasing number of high school graduates and an anticipated enrollment cliff, right, that's going to make enrollment increasingly a challenge for institutions, I think, across the country, it's a concerning thing. Should we worry about institutions moving into the prison-based post-secondary education space purely to make a profit? And I guess if we're not worried about that, or even if we are, how can we think about quality of education in that environment? Because I think the quality part is, of course, important to the credential as well.
Poor Terrell has heard me talk about this for years. The answer to your first question is yes, and it's already happening. And I think there were a number of folks in the field before Second Chance Pell launched, kind of saying, hey, there should be some guardrails in place here. We've seen this, for example, with veteran students where federal student aid is exploited for programs and institutions with questionable quality, for example. I think the challenge in this space, however, is that some of these institutions have done and continue to do a really good job of working with corrections. And so you have some corrections, particularly statewide corrections agencies, that might contract with a particular institution to say that all your books will get cleared if they're sent from here. Whereas your local institution, let's say a college or nonprofit university, doesn't have that relationship. It means that in terms of exposure for what incarcerated people have exposure to, it means that the exposure level for that other institution, the one that's maybe less quality or questionable quality, is going to get a greater share of exposure. And so I say that to say that all of the things that we should be worried about, the answer is yes, are amplified in the carceral setting, because there's just such a kind of obscurity to how corrections operates. And so to Terrell's point, bringing corrections folks along, getting them on board, trying to educate them on what a Pell Grant is and what federal student aid is. I think there's been some states where that's been, that is moving forward in, I think, productive ways. There's also states where it's just not working at all. And we've got lots of internal politics. So I don't want to make it sound easier than it is for some people. But I think the concerns are there. And if you look across the board at who we incarcerate, right, we're not just talking about kind of an equal slice of the population here. We're talking about folks who, at the time of arrest, the vast majority haven't been able to complete that secondary credential yet. So we're talking about transfer students, we're talking about returning adults, we're talking about veterans, we're talking about adult learners. We're talking about a lot of the student populations that we've been kind of talking about in the higher ed kind of educational landscape for some time. But those kinds of identities are compounded when we throw incarceration experience and the barriers that brings on top of it. And so I think one of the kind of added responsibilities we have here is we know that this is already happening. Unfortunately, we already know that these players are in the space. And I think there's a number of folks trying to do the good work, some of the organizations that Terrell mentioned. The best thing that we can do is to educate incarcerated people and their families and the folks on the outside to say, here's kind of what quality means. Here's what accreditation is. And here are the kinds of questions when someone comes and says, hey, you can go to college for free. It's called this Pell Grant, fill this out and sign here. Here are some questions that we can ask. But I want to be really clear, that is not a perfect solution, and nor should it be acceptable. I would have liked to see a lot more firm guidance coming out. And I'm hopeful that we can still get some of that as we continue to move forward.
Thank you. All right, so back to Terrell for a moment. So even if we have the strongest possible academic programming in place, so let's say all of the concerns that Erin mentioned a moment ago were moot, we know there are lots of hiccups in offering classes in a correctional environment, right? And so what are some of the ways that you think DOCs could improve operations to make post-secondary education easier for students to complete? I believe you are on. There we go.
Yeah. So I first want to say that, I totally echo Erin's, sentiments. Those are things that, we should definitely be on the lookout for as, those, what you named as tuition dependent institutions enter this space. We know, those who have been in this space for a while now know that there are a number of, institutions that either get their foot in the door some way, shape, or form that isn't the same process that others may get in the door. And then also to the point of quality programming, you can sometimes see the, challenging programs, and I'm talking about like in terms of academic rigor, no longer continue while another program does. And those are all things that, we should really be on the lookout for as Pell grants are reinstated and programs begin to arise. But, to your question around how DOCs can improve the operations and make the PSE programs just a little bit more smoother, I think it is leaning on what I would assume, or who I would assume are the experts, which is the education institutions, as well as those who are directly impacted, whether they're currently or formerly incarcerated people or organizations that represent those groups. I think when you lean on those who have that level of expertise, it almost always makes things much more smoother. So there are things that aren't in the hands of corrections that they, just possibly can't do. And that I really think goes back to how prisons were designed, the purpose of prisons and other carceral spaces. So what I'm speaking to specifically is like, I think an ideal situation is if you have three or four colleges knocking on the door of, a particular prison and wanting to teach inside and saying, you don't have to worry about anything. We have our funding in place. We have professors, we have the capacity to teach in here. That's a great situation, right? 4 different colleges, let's say they're all high quality, offer student support services, thinking about reentry, all of that. The fact of the matter is that the way prisons were designed, they don't have the space to accommodate. So when you have ESL programs, English as a second language, when you have, whatever high school diploma or GED classes going on, everything else, I visited facilities where people were taking college courses in the mess hall or the cafeteria, for those who may be on this call and not know what the mess hall is. I've seen classes take place in the mess hall or the visiting room. And that was corrections trying to make it work, right? Which I definitely applaud them for. And this is in no way, shape, or form, I don't want these words to be misconstrued. I'm not asking for bigger and better prisons. For me, this is all a reason why they should be eliminated. and for so many other reasons, the public health issues and things like that come into play. But, I just wanted to name that space issue. I've seen it play out with just one college trying to get in to the door, and it wasn't correction. It wasn't a matter of corrections, purposely not trying to work with them. It's literally like, we have all the programming that we can possibly have on the schedule on a weekly basis. We wish we could do more. And again, the answer for me is to not build more prisons. I'd like to actually see, let's clear out that unit, that third unit that's maybe about a couple hundred yards from this main building. Let's send all those people home and let's change that into an education space. That's something that you're working with decarceration now, while also trying to improve the incarceration, experience for folks. But, again, that would even take consulting with others outside of the correction space, because that is not, I'm pretty confident that is not going to be an idea that's even really presented from folks who are professionals and experts in that space.
Yeah. Thank you, Terrell.
David, can I just say, Terrell, as you were talking, I kept looking at like, how do I do an emoji and a like and a heart, and I can't, but I was trying to do that while you were talking that whole time.
I appreciate it.
So Erin, I'm thinking about a lot of the work that I've done within prisons recently, and during COVID, I know a lot of prison systems moved many things to tablets because they weren't able to offer the congregate programming that they had done before. And so it's made me realize, in thinking about, for example, post-secondary education in prisons, colleges have a number of options, right, when it comes to how they deliver content. And so I'm wondering if there's a research base and what that research base might tell us about different modes of delivery. So for example, is coursework delivered solely by tablet as effective as in-person instruction? What about like hybrid courses? Do we have any sense of what seems to work best?
Yeah, well, let me first just say we need much more evidence in this space, much more reliable evidence. And so I think, if we have a chance to talk about future directions for research, this would definitely be a space where I would suggest folks put some attention toward. I think if we step back and look at the kind of evidence base for online education, we know that colleges and universities can provide high quality, engaging online educational experiences that include high impact practices. So things like co-learning, things like undergraduate research, internships, portfolios, all those kinds of things. And so I don't think the question necessarily is about the modality. The question is about the modality in that space and what it ultimately ends up looking like. And I'll speak just from the research that we've done. We just wrapped up a project in the fall, kind of over 3 years, looking at second chance Pell sites. And on sites that are using tablet-based education. And so these are tablets that don't connect to Wi-Fi unless you kind of put them in a docket. And then, students do that when they are able to get to the docket, and then they can, download what they need, and then take that tablet. In some prisons, they can take it back to their housing unit. In other prisons, they cannot. They have to use it in a actually kind of shared space. In some prisons, some students have a tablet, others, there's not enough tablets for every student to have their own. And so there's the kind of process implementation of all of this that is very inconsistent across sites. And of the programs that were included in our study over 3 years, there is not one single person from the college or university whose job it is to be at that facility to ensure that students have X number of contact hours on that tablet for that course, right? Instead, what ends up happening is staff at the prison, typically educational coordinators and education staff who care deeply about their students, are working 2 to 3 jobs to try to make sure that a student who's typing up a paper in a comment box can actually get it formatted to APA format, right? So there's an implementation process that I think for folks who have not been inside, we sometimes tend to assume that, oh, okay, well, it's on a tablet. Students must be kind of interacting with instructors. In our research, we found a number of incidents where students would message an instructor in week 4 and never hear back. Some students talked about never being able to live engage with their instructor. Lots and lots of frustration about technology not working and not knowing who to contact when it doesn't work. And all of this, right, on the tech side is one thing. And then there's the lockdowns. And then there's all the prison-specific restrictions that happen, right? So I've got a paper due by 4 p.m. Well, there's a lockdown. I can't get the tablet to the place to upload to the Wi-Fi to be able, yada, yada, yada. Imagine having a question on homework and you have to get to the place to message your instructor. The instructor doesn't respond back. The assignment's due. You don't do well, right? You can kind of see where this is going. And so part of the challenge in this space is that when we think of kind of high quality online education in the post-secondary landscape, that is absolutely, by and large, not what's taking place in the prison environment. Now, there are outliers, but they're few and far between. For the most part, what we know is that incarcerated students are not engaging in the same kinds of quality higher education via a tablet or distance-based or hybrid learning than non-incarcerated students. In addition to that, I think where there is some optimism here, where we need to kind of push towards, is that this isn't, I don't think we're at the point where it's like, oh, we just can't do online. That shouldn't be the takeaway here. What the takeaway should be, and I've seen a couple questions in the chat around like, how do we get colleges or how do we get prisons to loosen restrictions? It has to happen. If we are going to provide high quality post-secondary education, there is really no reason why students should be trying to type a research paper in a comment box. Like, there's just no excuse for that. And so I think part of this has really got to get into questions around what is the user experience? We know what we're doing and we say we're doing, and we know our enrollments and we all know all this, but when it actually trickles down to the students, and Terrell, you brought this up earlier, right? It's like, how are students experiencing this? What is the experience in that class? And I want to just make a plug here. It doesn't mean that we have to interview students. You certainly can, but there are complications to that. Look at the learning management system analytics. Look at how many times folks have logged in. Look at the questions that go unanswered, right? And so I think if you're at an institution where your prison higher ed program is using Moodle or Canvas or Blackboard, right? Those analytics exist. Those data exist. And so those are some very clear questions that if you pull right off the bat, you'll be able to see some striking inequalities around student engagement.
Wow, thank you. That's really helpful. And I guess you sort of started down this road a little bit, but just to probe a bit more, Erin, I'm wondering, aside from the modality issue and some of the other issues that you raised, what do you think are some of the biggest unresolved questions in the literature on this topic? So where specifically should researchers be devoting their efforts?
Oh, it's such a good question. We could do a whole other webinar just on this. Well, I'll say from the kind of learning standpoint, we do need more information, but I always caution. I have a lot of, and I'm thankful, a lot of doctoral students reaching out saying, hey, I want to study this. I want to go and talk to incarcerated people. And I, as someone who's never been incarcerated and as someone who has run a program, I'm always a bit cautious, particularly given the situation that our incarcerated students are put in, because, to say negative things about the program can sometimes put them at risk and put the program at risk. And so I would just encourage people to be really thoughtful. That being said, there are all sorts of ways to research that space that doesn't focus on simply the incarcerated student's voice, right? All the ways that we know that we kind of research student engagement, for example, that we could implement with incarcerated students. Course analytics, learning outcomes, and there's a dissertation coming up that I encourage folks to read. I won't share much more, but I'm hoping he'll put it on the listserv. I do think one of the areas that is critical right now is post-participation or post-completion outcomes. And part of the reason is that we know that participating in post-secondary education in the aggregate, right, the completion of an undergraduate degree pretty much increases all the variables across a higher quality of life. You're going to live longer on average. You're going to have greater access to healthcare on average, yada, yada, yada. What we don't know is what role a criminal record or an incarceration history plays, right? And so what we know in terms of employment outcomes, for example, right? We know that your outcomes for employment, your opportunities increase once you have a degree. We want to be able to say the same thing about folks who have served time, but we don't have that research yet, by and large. And so that's a really critical space so that we can see, like, are people getting hired? And I think anecdotally, and I'm sure Terrell can share much more than I can, the answer is yes, in trades. That's where folks are getting hired because they're not able to get hired in other spaces. And so I think that's an area. I think the other area we really want to look at is the use of Pell grants for short-term credentials. The research that we've done, we know that the majority of Pell usage right now is on short-term credentials. And so these are, in theory, stackable, right? But they're not an applied associate's degree. They're not an associate's degree. And some of the research that we have for non-incarcerated students is concerning. And it shows kind of questions about post-employment salaries or post-graduation salaries, excuse me. And, the ability to actually stack onto that. And so we need some research to see what's happening after folks use their limited Pell funds during incarceration to earn these credentials, what's happening in the labor market, what's happening inside the prison, what's just happening post. And then I think the last thing I'll mention, because I could talk to you about this all day, David, is that when we think about incarcerated students, and I see if Stephanie's on here who asked this question, at this point in time, it is not required that colleges and universities report on outcomes for incarcerated students. And so at this point in time, we cannot tell you with a great degree of accuracy how many students are enrolled in programs across the country. What are they enrolled in? Are they full-time students? What's their time to degree? What's their rate of persistence? These are critical questions that we've got to be able to answer if we're going to continue to expand access and equity and quality. I'll stop there for now.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. And just to be clear, stackable credentials are things like certificates that in theory, if you do multiple of them, will eventually add up to a formal degree, correct? That's what you mean by stackables.
Yes, and that could, that will, when I say stack in, so let's say you did that credential, right? That credential kind of goes into the next degree. So it's not, there are courses that you don't have to retake, they actually count toward that next credential.
Excellent. Thank you for clarifying. For those that aren't familiar with stackable credentials, yeah, thank you. And so I have one more question I'm going to ask before we move to the audience Q&A, and there's some super interesting questions there, so I want to make sure we have time to do some of those. But I'm going to pose this to both of you, Erin and Terrell. We'll start with Terrell maybe, and then go to Erin. And that is, if you look into your crystal ball, what does prison-based post-secondary education look like 20 years from now? What do you think is going to be working well? And what do you think we're still going to be trying to figure out?
So I mean, hopefully in 20 years, and maybe this isn't really a crazy idea, but hopefully we'll be closer toward decarcerating this country. And if that is not a likely scenario where less and less prisons exist, then I guess second to that is having, and specifically with, post-secondary education programs, I think having programs that across the country are operating with a racial equity lens. So that's something that speaking to one of your questions earlier, things that, just kind of like looking out for is what's the representation of people of color in a given institution, and what it looks like race-wise in the classroom. And that's something that, I think most people are pretty much aware, even if they're not involved in this work, that most people of color are, populating our prison system in most states, not all of them. But then the college classrooms are normally flipped and there's less people of color. So I think, that's something that both myself, Erin, and a few others in this space have, mentioned and pointed to, that is something that we definitely want to change. And I think that's something that in 20 years, hopefully I'm not on the Zoom, speaking about something like this, or any platform for that matter. I think institutional policies that don't penalize people for, being sent to segregation or restrictive housing. That's something that currently there's dozens of programs that when I'm meeting with the college partners, both the corrections person and the college folks, and even when I speak to incarcerated learners, they share that, a person, maybe got into a fight on the unit. And if you look at the details, that person was actually attacked because there's lack of resources. There are a handful of, states normally in the southern region where they're completely deprived of all types of resources, and getting something as frivolous to us as like a clean, crisp, white t-shirt. If that's something that is not available to everybody and someone approaches you for that shirt, and now you have to either give it up, which can then lead to so many other altercations later on, because now everyone sees that that's a sign of weakness or something like that. You either give it up because you don't want to miss out on your opportunity to participate in college, so you're thinking about your reentry, or you defend yourself. And if something like that happens, and this is a real situation that now happens, and then the institutional policy is that if something like that, a ticket or any type of infraction happens, that leads to you no longer participating in college programming. And we have to get folks on board to understand why that is not a sound policy, because you're literally snatching away people's opportunity to prepare themselves and their families when they come home. I think, two other things that I think about is the nature of crime. So, a lot of the times policy reforms come out and I'll look at the headline and say, wow, this is great. And then as I read the article, it says that, and this is their words, violent offenders, sex offenders, all of these people except low-level crimes can now take part in this magnificent program. We need to make sure that that's not happening overall. But since this conversation is on college and prison, we shouldn't be saying that people who have long sentences cannot participate in the program. Your sentence length should not matter, nor should the nature of your crime. It's something that should be accessible to everyone. And I think overall, in 20 years from now, I would love to just see the world operate in a way where people are no longer reduced to or judged by their past, and instead, looked at for who they are in present day. So a crime that you committed at 18, or let's just forget the age, that happened 10, 20 years ago, we should not be looking at someone today and deciding that they are who they were while incarcerated or when they were involved in that crime. I looked at, I was on Google a few weeks ago and saw that I was or am a part of a pretty esteemed group of people that include Martha Stewart, Tim Allen, I think Lori Loughlin, hip hop artist Meek Mill. These are people that have been to jail or prison, yet none of them are referred to as former offenders. Mark Wahlberg was incarcerated before. Not one of them are spoken about when they're announced or talked about that they're former convicts or ex-offender. These people are looked at still as celebrities. Some of them has been so long since their incarceration that most people don't even know about it. I'd love to see a space where I'm no longer introduced as, an expert on the formerly incarcerated or currently incarcerated people, and I'm just who I am because of what I bring to this work. And 20 years from now, I hope that is the case.
Thank you, Terrell. Erin.
Co-sign everything Terrell just said. I think if we look historically, we don't have a great historical record. And so, in 20 years from now, I still think we are going to be dealing with the challenge of the fragility of this space. And what I mean by that is that what we typically say here in Utah is that we operate at the invitation of corrections. We are not contracted with the Department of Corrections. The Department of Corrections at any time can decide to say, we no longer want the University of Utah here. And a number of four-year institutions in particular operate on that model. Increasingly, we've seen some state legislative action where, we have some kind of system-wide approaches. I'm hopeful that we'll see some more of that just to kind of protect access. But I think at the end of the day, and what so many folks know who work in this space, is that corrections is the end-all be-all. And, that means that we can I see all sorts of questions in the chat around how do I do this with these restrictions? And how do I do this with these restrictions? And what I want to just say is that there's a whole professional community out there who are answering these questions. The Alliance for Higher Education in Prison is a national nonprofit. go there, sign up for the listserv, get on the formerly incarcerated college graduate network, sign up for their listserv and newsletter. These are conversations that are happening in this space. I will say I have a hope that in 20 years from now, I'm also not on a webinar with Terrell, and that you have many more people like Terrell to choose from. Because what I think Terrell would co-sign here is that there's simply not enough folks at this point who have been provided the access to higher education inside, who are successfully being mentored and being supported in pursuing and finishing higher education outside. And I know that's part of what FICGN is doing. And so I'm hopeful that in 20 years we're there. I'm also hopeful that in 20 years we are at a place where if Pell funding were to be pulled, we're not going to see another 1994. And that was a question in one of the chats. So I'll just say, what does that mean? It means that colleges and universities, particularly, we can also look at other institutions, social services in the state, for example, need to fund this work. And we know that it takes a lot of funding to do this work well. It just does. It takes people driving to the prison. It takes your IT staff getting out to the facility. And that means salaries, that means benefits, that means the institution committing to taking this work seriously. And that means that they're going to support it. And that's a huge lift. I'll say that as someone who's been at a university where it's taken over 10 years to get to where we're at now. But I think that's where we're going to have to be in 20 years if we're not going to repeat where we've been.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you both for all of those thoughtful responses. And I want to get through at least maybe 3 or so of our audience questions, if not more than that. But I'll start with one that I actually have thought a good bit about. And I'm going to put this to Terrell, although Erin, if you'd like to jump in, please do, which is that for people in prison, there's usually an opportunity cost of pursuing education because you can't necessarily hold a paid job, right? So even with the ridiculously low pay that most people who are incarcerated get for the jobs that they are doing, it's still sometimes the only money they have for their commissary because their families aren't able to send money to put on their books. So do you have any suggestions about how we might reconcile those things? How can we reduce the disparities that we see there?
Yeah, great question. And it's actually one of the things that I, have on my wish list. I couldn't get through everything, of course, but yeah, making sure that people don't have to decide on whether or not they're going to prioritize their future for, coming home possibly with a degree or as close as possible as they can so that they can begin searching for, quality employment opportunities. For them to have to choose that or compare that to, having to work right now in the moment and gather whatever pennies you can for producing labor for the state, that shouldn't be. And I think in, a number of states, these conversations are beginning to, happen where we're no longer making people have to make that decision on whether or not they're going to earn money for commissary or sending money home to their families or enrolling in college. We should make sure that, the student experience is something that they still receive compensation for, maybe in the form of a stipend if wording changes anything. But it is a real situation, and we'll love to see that, change.
And Erin, I want to put another question to you, which follows up on something you talked about earlier, which is that we know that the limited sort of knowledge base we have on these programs typically looks at recidivism as the outcome. So if we want to demonstrate to policymakers, legislators that Pell is working in the prison space and creating benefits, what sorts of metrics should we be looking at? What outcomes would you choose, Erin, if you could design your study and have access to any data that you wanted and thinking about the outcomes that we should care about? Pie in the sky.
I will say that we are we're going to launch a center here at the University of Utah to answer some of those questions that I'm very excited about. And so for folks who are interested in research, connect with us. What I think I'll speak as an education researcher, right? One of the questions that we can ask are, what are the educational outcomes that contribute to reduced recidivism, for example, right? So we can tell you that, recidivism rates drop by 40-some%. How? Why? What are the variables educationally that we can measure? And Terrell mentioned earlier, kind of post-graduation salary metrics. Increasingly, colleges and universities are reporting on these things. That's one area that I think we could be very specific about. So if we look at, let's say, post-completion earnings among folks who participate, that's also going to get at the question of the degree to which a criminal record or incarceration experience, or the both, can impact someone's ability to successfully gain employment. And I want to be really clear here, in a meaningful way, right? Not just getting a job to have a job and satisfy parole violations or whatever, but to have the kind of job that we want all students to have. We want them to make meaning and to feel valuable and to feel like they're contributing. That's what we should want and be able to measure eventually for formerly incarcerated people. I will say that, higher ed in general, we struggle a bit in kind of communicating our value writ large. So, I'll say that. But the things that we do know well that we can say, we should be looking toward for this particular group of students as well. And so if we're thinking about increased critical thinking and, somebody's transferability of skills and folks' ability to navigate difficult situations, right? Those are all things that are measurable, and they're all things that we can implement in this space that are educational. And let me be really clear. I think folks in criminology should still be doing that research. Like, that's super important, and I don't want any of that to stop. I just think we've got to step up in the higher ed space to start treating formerly incarcerated and currently incarcerated students as college students.
Thank you. That's great. And we are about to run out of time, but one last very quick question. So if both of you could respond as briefly as you could possibly respond, how can the public show support for post-secondary education programs like these, aside from voting for policymakers or elected officials who support them?
Terrell, you want to go?
I will. I would say find a program locally that is near in your vicinity, and see if there's ways that you can get involved, and ask them specifically what challenges that they have with their students as they're released, or something of that nature. I think that's one of the most easiest ways that you can get involved.
I will just echo that and say, and I've said this in a lot of folks in the chat, you are in a space where this work is being done. Even if you're in a state, we have a national directory, even if you're in a state where there's just a few programs, getting inside and getting to connect with the people who are doing the work is really, really important. And if for any reason, or for whatever reason, you can't do that, you don't want to do that, throw them some money. These programs are, particularly for those of us who run programs at no cost to incarcerated people, there's a lot of costs in this. And so those are maybe two ways that you could directly support.
Fantastic. Thank you, Terrell. Thank you, Erin. What a great conversation. I really appreciate both of your time today. And thanks to all of you who joined us. If you would please remember to take the event survey, and also remember that if you'd like to look at the recording, it will be available on the event page after today. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.